We haven't talked about the situation in Gaza for a wee while, for a few days, and there have been some developments, obviously. First, I just want to note that in Israel, Benny Gantz, who is a moderate in the Israeli cabinet, has resigned. He's a former chief of their military, Benny Gantz, and he threatened to resign from Benjamin Netanyahu's emergency war cabinet, which some are suggesting leaves the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's pretty hawkish already, with a hardliner cabinet, Benny seen as a moderate. I am not sure, because I do not follow Israeli politics with a microscope, exactly what that means. But I will note that, of course, in recent days, an operation to rescue 4 of the still more, I think, 120 hostages left, was successful. And it was successful because people held against their will and kidnapped were liberated. And they were liberated safe and well and taken back to their homes and families. They were being held, it would seem, at least some of them, in the home of someone who worked, for the Palestinian or the Hamas government, and also claimed to be a journalist and had done some work for Al Jazeera. Having them in his home, which was near a refugee camp, and it was just, the absolutely showed you how it is really hard to delineate between the people in Gaza and the military and the terrorists, and how they basically are all intermingled. But it was amazing to see the Mintos of this world, and their reaction was that it was a terrible massacre. Well, F around and find out. You go in and you get your people back. Sorry, that is a consequence. And I thought to myself, this would be like, and we go back to one of the most famous and successful anti-terrorism hostage-freeing raids in the history of the world, the raid at Entebbe. And most of you may have only seen it as a movie. I was a very young man when it happened. But the raid at Entebbe, where Israeli commandos flew into Idi Amin's backyard to Entebbe airport and freed, with very minimal casualties, a large number of hostages, and put them on a Hercules and took them back to Israel. It was an amazing story. I imagine if that happened today, they'd say Israelis invade, right? And Idi Amin was the good guy. So what the hell's going on here? And how's the world got so warped when it deals with these things? To discuss all this, and indeed this resignation, we're joined now from the Israel Institute of New Zealand by David Cumin. David, lovely to have you back with us. It's been a while.
Good morning, Sean. How are you?
Very well. Well, that's good news, the release of the hostages, or the rescuing. It wasn't a release, it was a rescue, wasn't it?
Correct. It was an incredible mission. And really a flash of light, and rejoicing all over the world to have 4 hostages rescued. Unfortunately, of course, one of the commandos fell in battle, and the mission has been renamed Mission Arnon after him.
Yeah.
And there's still 120 people that we need to rescue.
Yeah. I made a comparison with the raid at Entebbe.
Yeah, interesting. I think the recent rescue mission was far more complex. It was in a heavily populated civilian area as opposed to an airport. It was during daytime as opposed to under the cover of darkness. But, you know, in terms of the ability of the IDF to gather the right intelligence, to plan and prepare and then execute some of the most complex military operations in the world, and free hostages and save their people and bring them back to freedom is extraordinary.
Nevertheless, David, and from the usual suspects, condemnation of the rescue mission as a massacre.
Well, so there's a few things to break down in that, of course. The first is that the rescue mission would never be needed if Hamas just released the hostages.
Yep.
And so that's the very first thing.
Against that. Yeah.
This is why it was needed. So it was needed. given that there are so many militants in and around still some of the areas in Gaza, and certainly you would think that they would be protecting or defending the hostages, it was almost inevitable that there was going to be some sort of conflict to get these people out. They were in apartment buildings on different floors in different buildings, and it was obviously heavily populated areas, and so there was going to be some fighting, unfortunately. I don't think anyone would have said otherwise. And so then the question becomes, well, how many people were killed? We know there was one Israeli commando. How many of Hamas or other terrorist entities, militants, were killed? We don't know that answer entirely. How did any civilians die? Because there were reports of RPG fire from terrorists in Gaza, obviously not hitting the IDF. So where did those grenades land, and did they kill their own civilians again? So these are all open questions. Now, the Hamas Ministry of Health, or whatever you want to call it, the terrorist groups are saying there were 270-something people who were massacred by the evil Israelis. The IDF says there were fewer than 100 people that died.
Hey, David, can we just... Are you moving around at all? We're just having some dropout on your phone there.
No, I'm not.
Okay, all right.
Is that better?
David, can we just hold? We'll call you back and just get a better line. We're just having some dropout that seems to be getting worse. Just hold on. Okay, and Ben, Josh is doing that right now. Entebbe happened, and you're right, 1976. I was 12 years old, the raid at Entebbe. And an airliner had been taken by Palestinian, or they German terrorists. No, they were German terrorists, I think, in sympathy with Palestinians. Okay, and David, we've got you back.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. Not your fault, probably ours. Okay, look, I also want to ask, where were these hostages being held?
In the Nusayrat suburb of Gaza, in two different apartment buildings. There's been a bit of conflicting reporting, so I'm not entirely sure exactly who was holding them, but it's pretty certain that they were held by civilians, as in not Hamas militants in Gab, and which raises all sorts of...
And some suggestion one of them was a spokesman for a ministry and a part-time journalist.
Yes, so the man that you're referring to, Jamal, had written an op-ed for Al Jazeera and was a journalist for the Hamas news outlet, the Chronicle. Wow.
Okay. Are you surprised that some have called this an Israeli massacre rather than a rescue mission? I've got to say, I'm amazed that the world is that out of whack.
Yeah, it's on some level I'm not surprised, because there are obviously people out there that will take every single opportunity, regardless of what it is, to twist the facts and attack Israel, and defame and slander and libel and make up stories. What's really disappointed me is how reasonable, or people who should be reasonable, have taken those lines and run them. And Radio New Zealand is the prime example at the moment in New Zealand. They ran a story that headlined with "Real Massacre" as Israel rescues 4 hostages.